بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
As you've guessed from the title of this video, we are going to discuss the status of women in Islam, between revelation and reality. When people talk about women in Islam today, the conversation is almost always loud, usually polarized, and rarely well-informed. On one side, you hear the celebratory claim that Islam liberated women 1400 years before modern feminism existed. On the other, you hear the equally sweeping assertion that Islam is an inherently oppressive system that has always subjugated women. Both slogans make for satisfying sound bites. Both miss the deeper, more important story. For every person who claims Islam liberated women, another insists it oppresses them. To truly understand, we have to go back to the 7th century. In this video we'll discuss the status of women in Islam. No fluff, no apologetics, no agenda. Just sources, history, and theology. Let's begin. To understand what Islam did for women, you must first understand the world it entered. In pre-Islamic Arabia, what Muslims call the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, the status of women was not merely disadvantaged. It was, by virtually any measure, catastrophic. Female infanticide was not a marginal practice. It was embedded in the social culture of the Arabian Peninsula, carried out by families who viewed the birth of a daughter as a source of shame. Fathers buried their newborn daughters alive. Women were inherited as property when their male relatives died, passed from one male guardian to another like any other object of wealth. They had no right to own property. They had no share in inheritance. They had no legal standing in any court or dispute. They could not choose whom they married or refuse whom they were forced to marry. They were, in the most precise legal sense, possessions. Umar ibn al-Khattab, who would go on to become one of the greatest caliphs in Islamic history, a man renowned for his strength of character, offered an extraordinary personal testimony to how completely this changed within his own lifetime. He said, "In Jahiliyyah, we used to have no regard for women whatsoever. But when Islam came and Allah made mention of them, this caused us to realize that they have rights upon us." This was not the admission of an enemy of Islam making a concession. It was the confession of a former patriarch who had been personally transformed by revelation. The man who had lived in the culture of Jahiliyyah was bearing witness to what revelation did. Now let us look at what Islam specifically legislated, and the comparison we need to make is not with 21st century liberal democracies. It is with 7th century Arabia, 7th century Persia, 7th century Byzantium, and 7th century Europe. First right the Islam inaugurated is the right to life. The Quran explicitly and directly outlawed female infanticide. This was not a soft encouragement toward better behavior. It was a criminalization of a deeply entrenched cultural practice. The Quran declared in Surah At-Takwir, verses 8 and 9 that, "And when the girl buried alive is asked, for what sin was she killed?" The choice of framing is striking. The question on the Day of Judgment is not directed at the fathers who committed this act. It is directed at the daughters, asking them what sin they had committed to deserve death. The moral logic is devastating. They were innocent. The crime was of the fathers. And the practice was over. Islam gave women the right to own property independently, to retain their own earnings in full, and to inherit from deceased relatives. These rights were not conditional on any male guardian's permission. A wife's wealth was legally hers alone, her husband had no claim to it, could not access it without her consent, and had no right to spend it on behalf of the household. To understand how radical this was, married women in England did not receive the right to own independent property until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, more than 1200 years after the Quran had already established this right. The French Civil Code of 1804, Napoleon's landmark legal system, explicitly denied married women the right to contract independently. The Roman law tradition that shaped European legal systems treated a married woman's property as passing under her husband's control. The scholar and historian Laila Ahmed, whose work Islam and the Status of Women is one of the most careful scholarly treatments of this question, concluded that Islam effected a transformation in the status of women unparalleled in any other major religious tradition. Even historians who are not Muslim and bring no particular sympathy to the faith acknowledge the scale of what the Quran accomplished. Then Islam gave women the right to consent in marriage. The pre-Islamic custom of treating women as objects to be exchanged between families, without any consultation of the woman herself, was explicitly ended. The marriage contract in Islam requires the offer and acceptance of both parties, meaning the woman's explicit consent is a legal condition for the validity of the marriage. No valid Islamic marriage can be concluded without the bride's agreement. The Prophet was asked by a woman whose father had given her in marriage without her consent. He gave her the right to have the marriage annulled. The principle was established and applied. A woman's silence could not be taken as consent in a first marriage. Her vocal agreement was required. A previously married woman had to give explicit verbal consent. Then came the right to education. The Prophet said, "Seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim." The Arabic word used, Muslim, includes both men and women without any linguistic qualification. The obligation to seek knowledge was not a male privilege, it was a human one. The Prophet went further in practice. When women approached him and said that the men were monopolizing his time and they were not receiving adequate religious instruction, he designated a specific day exclusively for their education. He taught them, he answered their questions, he took their learning as seriously as the learning of men. Perhaps the most profound change the Quran brought was not legal but metaphysical, the declaration that men and women are spiritually equal before Allah. Surah Al-Hijab contains a passage, verse 35, that is remarkable in its deliberateness. It lists 10 qualities in parallel pairs: Muslim men and Muslim women, believing men and believing women, obedient men and obedient women, truthful men and truthful women, patient men and patient women, humble men and humble women, charitable men and charitable women, fasting men and fasting women, those who guard their chastity among men and those who guard their chastity among women, those who remember Allah greatly among men and women, and then concludes, "For them Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward." The grammatical structure of Arabic is itself a statement of perfect parity, not similar, not comparable, identical. This verse, according to the Seerah literature, was actually revealed in response to a question raised by a woman, Salama, the wife of the Prophet, who asked why the Quran seemed to speak primarily to men. The revelation responded to her question directly, by name. The Quran itself was responsive to women's voices. Now, let's discuss the Quran's view of women. This is where the conversation becomes more complex. Many people get confused. The terms role and status are different. The Quran's foundational statement about the relationship between men and women begins with their shared origin. O mankind, fear your Lord, who created you from one soul and created from it its mate and dispersed from both of them many men and women. This is not the story of a secondary creation. There is no rib narrative in the Quran, no suggestion that woman was derived from man as a lesser being. Both are from the same nafs, the same essence, the same soul, the same origin. The Quran's anthropology begins with the equality of origin. On spiritual accountability, the Quran is equally unambiguous. Indeed, I do not waste the work of any worker among you, whether male or female, you are of one another. In the sight of Allah, a woman's deeds count exactly as much as a man's. No deed of piety, patience, charity, or righteousness is diminished by the gender of the person who performs it. But what about social and family roles? Here the Quran introduces a framework that has been the subject of extensive scholarly discussion and, at times, controversy. The verse most frequently discussed is from Surah An-Nisa, verse 34, "Men are the Qiwamah over women, because Allah has given one more strength than the other, and because they support them from their means." The word Qiwamah, often translated as protectors and maintainers, denotes a responsibility of provision and protection. Classical scholars across all four major legal schools are consistent on what this verse establishes. The financial obligation to maintain the household falls on the husband. A woman is not required to contribute financially to the household even if she is substantially wealthier than her husband. Her wealth remains her own. His obligation to provide is unconditional. What the verse does not establish, and what no classical scholar of standing has claimed it establishes, is the intrinsic spiritual or moral superiority of men over women. The term describes a functional responsibility, not a metaphysical hierarchy. The most noble person is the most God-conscious, regardless of gender. Allah says in the Quran, "Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you." The Quran also establishes corresponding rights, and women have rights similar to those over them in kindness. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 228. The word used, maruf, means what is recognized as good, fair, and just by any decent standard. Rights are mutual, duties are complementary. The framework is partnership, not subordination. Dr. Amina Wadood and other contemporary scholars argue that the fundamental Quranic principle is taqwa, God consciousness, and nothing else. The Quran itself says, "Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you." Gender is irrelevant to piety. Theology is one thing, but history is another. Let me introduce you to the women who lived through this revelation. Khatijah binte Khuwailid, the first Muslim and the Prophet's greatest support. Before she was the Prophet's wife, Khatijah binte Khuwailid was one of the most successful merchants in Arabia. She ran an international trading operation, employed agents to represent her interests across trade routes, and had a reputation for integrity and commercial acumen that was known throughout the Hijaz. She employed the young Muhammad ibn Abdullah, before he became a prophet, to lead her caravans. She proposed marriage to him. She was 15 years his senior. And when the first revelation came in the cave of Hira, and the Prophet returned trembling and afraid, it was to Khatijah that he turned. It was she who wrapped him in a cloak, steadied him with her presence, and said the words that became the foundation of his confidence, "By Allah, He will never disgrace you. You maintain family ties, you bear the burden of the weak, you earn for the poor, you are generous to the guest, and you help in times of calamity." She was the first person in all of humanity to accept Islam. She spent her entire fortune, every dirham she had accumulated over a lifetime of successful business, in support of the fledgling Muslim community. The Prophet said of her, years after her death, that she had believed him when others disbelieved, had consoled him when others drove him away, and had supported him with her wealth when others withheld theirs. He never stopped loving her. Khatijah's life is not merely an inspiring story. It is evidence, in the most concrete, historical sense, that the Islamic tradition, at its founding, had space for women who were financially independent, publicly successful, intellectually engaged, and capable of providing moral support to the Prophet himself. Aisha binte Abi Bakr, may Allah be pleased with her, was not merely a wife of the Prophet. She was one of the most prolific and rigorously accurate scholars in the entire history of Islamic jurisprudence and hadith. She narrated 2,210 hadith, a body of prophetic transmission that shaped Islamic law in every subsequent generation. After the Prophet's departure from physical world, senior companions, including the Caliphs Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, would come to consult her on matters of religious law, inheritance disputes, and theological questions. She corrected companions who misreported hadith. She issued legal opinions, fatwas. She taught students who sat before her and transmitted her knowledge to the next generation. She was also, at a critical moment in Islamic political history, a military commander, the central figure of the Battle of the Camel in 1936 AH, around which one of the first major political conflicts in Islamic history turned. Whatever one's view of her decision in that conflict, the fact that she commanded an army is evidence of the scope of authority that the early Muslim community recognized as possible for a woman. She lived for 45 years after the Prophet's death, continuing to teach and to be consulted. The scholar Al-Juhri said, if the knowledge of Aisha were gathered and placed on one side of a scale, and the knowledge of all the other wives of the Prophet and all other women on the other side, Aisha's knowledge would outweigh it. At the Battle of Uhud in 3 AH, one of the most traumatic military encounters in early Islamic history, during which the Muslim lines broke and the Prophet himself was wounded and surrounded, a woman fought with sword and shield. Her name was Nusayba bint Ka'b al-Majiniyah, known as Ammara. When the Muslim archers abandoned their posts and the Quraysh cavalry broke through, most of the men around the Prophet scattered. Nusayba remained. She fought. She sustained 12 wounds that day, including a severe neck wound that left her incapacitated for over a year. The Prophet looked up at one point during the battle and saw her defending him with her sword, and said, "Wherever I turned, right or left, I saw her fighting in my defense." She was not an anomaly, she was a precedent. And she was not the only woman who fought at Uhud or contributed to the early military campaigns. Women carried water for the wounded, tended to the injured, and in some cases engaged directly in combat. The prophetic community made space for this. Al-Shifa bint Abdullah, the first female government official. Al-Shifa bint Abdullah al-Qurshiyah was a woman of learning and leadership in the early Muslim community. She was one of the first people to be literate in Arabia and was herself a teacher. She taught the Prophet's wife Hafsa to write. She was also a practitioner of traditional medicine. The Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab appointed her as a market inspector, the Muhtasib, in Medina, a position of public administrative authority responsible for overseeing commercial practices, preventing fraud, and protecting consumers. This was a government appointment, with real authority over the public sphere. She held it, and held it with distinction. In 859 CE, a Muslim woman founded an institution that the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the UNESCO, and the Guinness Book of World Records recognized as the oldest continuously operating university in the world. Her name was Fatima al-Fihri. The institution she founded is the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fes, Morocco, still operating, still teaching, still producing scholars more than 11 centuries after its founding. Fatima al-Fihri came from a wealthy family of scholars who had migrated from Kairouan in modern-day Tunisia. She inherited her father's fortune and used it entirely, every dirham, to build this institution of learning. She personally oversaw its construction, fasted throughout the period of its building, and only broke her fast when it was completed. The world's oldest university was built by a Muslim woman. These were not hidden women. They were public figures, scholars, warriors, businesswomen, and leaders. They built institutions, they taught men, they lead. This is the practiced reality of the Prophet's community. Now, let's look into how Islam safeguards women's rights. Rights without protection are just words. So how does Islam build a protective architecture around women? Islam defines marriage as a solemn covenant. The Quran uses the term mithakan ghalithan, meaning a weighty covenant, the same term used to describe Allah's covenant with the prophets. This is not a casual arrangement. It is a binding, serious, and sacred commitment. Within this framework, specific protections are built in as legal rights, not as cultural practices dependent on the husband's goodwill. A woman retains her own family name upon marriage. She does not become a legal extension of her husband. She is entitled to a meher, a marital gift specified in the marriage contract, which belongs entirely to her and cannot be reclaimed by the husband. She has the right to be financially maintained by her husband without any reciprocal financial obligation. Even if she is substantially wealthier than him, she is not required to contribute a single dirham to household expenses. She has the right to initiate divorce through the process of khul, returning the meher to dissolve the marriage, if the marriage becomes untenable for her. The Prophet said, "The best of you are those who are best to their wives, and I am the best of you to my wives." This was spoken in a society that had treated women as chattels. It was a direct prophetic inversion of the prevailing values. The famous exchange in the Hadith literature is among the most widely known in Islam, and it carries within it a theological statement of enormous significance. A man came to the Prophet and asked, "Who is most deserving of my good companionship?" The Prophet said, "Your mother." The man asked, "Then who?" The Prophet said, "Your mother." "Then who?" "Your mother." "Then who?" Only then, after the third repetition, "Your father." This is not a sentiment, it is a legal and social framework. The mother's right to custody of young children in cases of marital separation is grounded in this elevation. The obligation of adult sons to financially maintain their mothers in old age is a legal duty. The moral standing of the mother in Islamic family ethics is, in quantifiable terms, 3 times greater than that of the father. The expression that paradise is beneath the feet of your mothers, narrated by Imam al-Nasai, is sometimes cited without its full weight being appreciated. It means that the path to paradise passes through how one treats one's mother. No equivalent hadith places the father in that position. Then comes the Islamic framework of modesty, which includes the concept of hijab, is frequently presented as a set of restrictions imposed on women. The Quranic structure of the relevant passage tells a different story. In Surah An-Nur, the command to lower the gaze and guard modesty is addressed first to believing men, verse 30, and then to believing women, verse 31. The responsibility for the character of a modest society begins with men. It does not begin with what women wear. When we talk about women, we can't leave out the topic of the hijab, which has become a debated topic in this modern world. No single piece of fabric carries more symbolic baggage in the modern world. So let's separate theology from perception. Theologically, the majority of classical scholars across all 4 major Sunni legal schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, hold that the hijab, covering the hair and body except the face and hands for adult women in public contexts, is a religious obligation, based primarily on Surah An-Nur, verse 31 and Surah Al-Hijab, verse 59, as well as supporting hadith narrations. This has been the mainstream scholarly consensus for over 1300 years. A minority scholarly position holds that it is strongly recommended but not obligatory. The theological position is therefore relatively settled. What is not settled, and what is genuinely important, is the distinction between what is an obligation before Allah and what any human authority has the right to enforce. The Quran's principle, "There is no compulsion in religion," is not a peripheral verse. It is one of the most frequently cited and broadly applicable principles in Islamic jurisprudence. The choice of whether to comply with a religious obligation is, ultimately, between the individual believer and Allah. No state, no family member, and no community has the Islamic authority to coerce religious observance. This means that while the obligation exists theologically, the enforcement of that obligation by any human authority, whether a government that mandates the hijab by law or a family that compels it through pressure and shame, violates the very principle of sincere, voluntary worship that Islam demands. A hijab worn under compulsion is not an act of worship. It is an act of compliance, and the two are not the same. When Muslim women speak about the hijab from their own experience, they speak in multiple voices, and both need to be heard honestly. For many Muslim women, the hijab is a source of genuine empowerment. It is a declaration of identity, a refusal to be reduced to the visual evaluation of one's body, a statement of agency over one's own presentation. Scholars have described it as a polysemic symbol. It embodies piety, ethical selfhood, and communal belonging, while also functioning as a tool of resistance against hypersexualization, colonial frameworks, and cultural erasure. British Muslim student Hannah Yusuf articulated this directly and memorably. She described her hijab not as an instrument of oppression but as a feminist statement, a refusal to be objectified, a claiming of dignity on her own terms. For other women, those who have had the hijab imposed on them by family pressure, cultural coercion, or state law, the experience can feel like a restriction rather than a freedom. This experience is also real. It is not a theological reality, it is the lived reality of coercion, and coercion, as established above, violates Islamic principle. The honest answer is therefore genuinely both. The hijab can be empowering, it can be a restriction, and the determining factor is not the garment itself but whether it is worn by choice. Theologically it is an obligation, in its earthly practice it is a matter of personal conscience and sincere relationship with Allah. There is a wise saying, if a man gets educated, you educate an individual, if a woman gets educated, you educate a nation, perfectly summarize the Islamic worldview of a woman's role as the primary educator and moral compass of future generations. The Prophet's own command of seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. Not every male Muslim, every Muslim. The Prophet did not merely say this, he acted on it. When women told him that men were taking up all of his available time for religious instruction, he designated a specific day exclusively for women's education. He engaged with women's questions seriously and at length, he treated their religious knowledge as important. And the community he built produced the greatest generation of female scholars in Islamic history. Imam al-Bukhari, the compiler of Sahih al-Bukhari, the most rigorously authenticated hadith collection in Sunni Islam and the most important Islamic text after the Quran, was, in the early stages of his education, taught at home by his mother and sister. The greatest hadith scholar in Islamic history received his first formation from women. The 8th century scholar Sit al-Wujara binte Umar was renowned throughout the Islamic world for her expertise in Sahih al-Bukhari. She taught men, she issued rulings, she was a recognized religious authority, she was one among many. Khatijah binte Khuwailid, as discussed before in this video, was a successful international merchant before Islam and after it. The Prophet worked for her. Women in the early Muslim community owned businesses, engaged in trade, managed their own finances, and were full legal actors in the commercial sphere. Islam gives women the full legal right to own property, buy, sell, invest, and manage their own economic affairs, entirely independently of any male guardian. This right is not conditional, not qualified, and not subject to the husband's agreement. Contemporary research has found that at the state level, Islam is not a major influence on women's economic rights, meaning that the restriction of women's economic participation in Muslim-majority countries is driven not by Islamic doctrine but by other cultural and economic factors. where tribal customs, political authoritarianism, or economic underdevelopment restrict women's access to economic life, they do so in defiance of Islamic principles rather than in fulfillment of them. When Muslim women have genuine access to education and economic opportunity, they flourish, as they have consistently demonstrated across every context where they have been given that access. So, the authentic principle: a society that educates its women educates its future. A society that economically empowers its women strengthens its entire economy. This is not Western feminism. This is Islamic precedent. Now, the question arises, why does the media portray Islam as oppressive to women? This is a question of history, politics, and money. Let me be direct. The dominant narrative in Western media about Muslim women is not a neutral observation arising from systematic analysis of evidence. It is a constructed representation with a documented history and identifiable political functions. When researchers analyzed coverage of Muslim women across both major liberal and major conservative Western media outlets, they found a striking and unusual degree of agreement. Both tended to represent Muslim women as oppressed, outside of society, and with hardly any agency. One researcher noted that when the leading liberal newspaper and the leading conservative newspaper in a society arrive at the same representation, it reveals something about the structure of public narrative, not a journalistic conclusion, but a shared cultural assumption that precedes the journalism. The roots of this narrative lie in the Orientalism of the 18th and 19th centuries. European colonial powers, most explicitly the French in Algeria, the British in India and Egypt, and the Dutch in Indonesia, used the figure of the oppressed Muslim woman to construct a moral justification for colonial rule. The claim was that European presence was liberating Muslim women from their backward, patriarchal religion. As the cultural scholar Leila Abulughar and others have documented, this liberation arrived with military force, economic exploitation, the destruction of existing social institutions, and the systematic suppression of local cultural and religious life. The bitter irony is that colonial policies frequently worsened the conditions of women in Muslim societies by dismantling the legal and social frameworks that had given them protection. The liberation narrative was, in practice, a justification for domination. The 2001 attacks and the subsequent war on terror revived and intensified this narrative. The condition of women under the Taliban in Afghanistan was deployed with extraordinary cynicism as a moral justification for military intervention. First Lady Laura Bush devoted an entire presidential radio address in November 2001 to the condition of Afghan women, not to offer them genuine assistance, but to frame a military campaign in humanitarian language. Research on media discourse from this period shows that Muslim women were framed in tautological narratives, their oppression was assumed, their agency was denied, and their voices were systematically absent from the discussions about their fate. The selection bias in coverage is systematic and well documented. When a Muslim woman is oppressed in a particular context, her religion is immediately foregrounded as the cause. Islam oppresses women. When a Muslim woman is a prime minister, a Nobel laureate, a Supreme Court justice, a pioneering scientist, or a successful business leader, her religion is rarely mentioned. The examples that confirm the narrative are amplified. The examples that challenge it are ignored. The result is a caricature, a Muslim woman who is perpetually victimized, perpetually silent, perpetually in need of rescue from outside. This caricature, as researchers have consistently noted, serves to deny the agency of women in Muslim societies and functions as a justification for interventionist policies that have, in practice, caused enormous suffering to the very women they claimed to be saving. Next question that comes to mind is, if Islam truly elevated women, why is that not always visible today? This is the million-dollar question. and it requires the most honest answer. Which is, if Islam gave women inheritance rights, why do some Muslim societies deny them in practice? If Islam honored the mother above the father, why are women in some Muslim-majority countries treated as second-class citizens? If Khatija was an independent businesswoman and Aisha was a jurist and scholar, why are girls denied education in some communities in the name of Islam? The honest answer has three distinct and separable layers. Many practices that genuinely oppress women in Muslim communities, honor killings, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, the denial of education, restrictions on movement and employment, are pre-Islamic or non-Islamic cultural traditions that have been falsely attributed to the religion. Scholars have consistently documented that these practices are the result of cultural customs rather than rigorously defined regulations in sacred texts. They predate Islam in the regions where they are practiced, they are condemned by classical Islamic jurisprudence, and they have no basis in the Quran or the authenticated Sunnah. The problem is that the distinction between Islam and culture is invisible to many outside observers, and is actively exploited by inside patriarchs who use religious language to give their cultural preferences theological cover. When a man restricts his wife's movement, denies his daughter an education, or commits violence against a female relative, and justifies this by saying, Islam requires it, he is lying. But the lie is rarely challenged from within the community with sufficient clarity and force. Over centuries of Islamic scholarship, the interpretive tradition was, with honorable exceptions, largely conducted by men, in societies shaped by deeply patriarchal assumptions, and those patriarchal assumptions inevitably shaped the interpretation of texts. As the scholar Dr. Asma Berlas argues in her groundbreaking work Believing Women in Islam, the problem is not the Quran. The Quran's commitment to the dignity, spiritual equality, and rights of women is clear on its face. The problem is patriarchal interpretations of the Quran, readings that filtered the text through cultural assumptions of male dominance and produced rulings that the text itself does not require. Contemporary Muslim scholars, female and male, are increasingly engaged in the work of what might be called hermeneutic recovery, returning to the primary texts and asking what they actually say, stripped of the layers of cultural interpretation that have accumulated around them. This is not a project of abandoning the tradition, it is a project of reclaiming what the tradition actually contains. Research conducted across multiple Muslim-majority countries has found that political instrumentalization, rather than doctrinal context, is the primary driver of socio-economic disparities between genders. When governments in Muslim-majority countries want to consolidate conservative support, they restrict women's rights. When they want to project an image of modernization, they expand them. Islam becomes a political tool, deployed or withdrawn based on the needs of those in power. The Saudi prohibition on women driving that was maintained until 2018 had no basis in Islamic law, as was noted by numerous scholars both inside and outside the country, and its eventual removal required no change to religious doctrine whatsoever. It was a political restriction enforced through religious authority, and it was removed when the political calculation changed. The gap between the ideal that Islam established and the reality of many Muslim societies today is real, substantial, and deeply painful, particularly for the Muslim women who live in that gap. Acknowledging it honestly is not an attack on Islam. It is a necessary act of intellectual honesty that the tradition itself demands. But that gap is not primarily caused by Islam. It is caused by culture, politics, poverty, and the abuse of religious authority by those who use it to serve their own interests rather than the interests of justice. And the solution, as many Muslim women scholars and activists consistently argue, is not less Islam but better Islam, a return to the authentic textual principles that gave women rights in the first place, and a refusal to allow those rights to be obscured by culture, politics, or patriarchal interpretation. As one researcher summarizes, the true teachings of Islam, rooted in the Quran and Sunnah, consistently advocate for justice, dignity, and the protection of women's rights. The challenge lies not in the revelation itself, but in its interpretation and application across different times and cultures. The question is not, why does Islam oppress women? The honest question, the one that Muslims must face and answer, is, why have Muslim societies failed to live up to the standards their own revelation set for them? Let me bring this together. 1400 years ago, in a society that buried its daughters alive, a revelation came. It said, women have the right to life, to education, to own property and keep their own earnings, to inherit, to choose their spouse and refuse the one they reject, to keep their own name upon marriage, to be financially maintained without any reciprocal financial obligation, to initiate divorce when marriage becomes untenable, to testify, to lead, to teach, to do business, to stand before their Creator with exactly the same spiritual worth as any man. Not similar worth, not comparable worth, but an identical worth. That revelation produced Khatija the international merchant, Aisha the jurist and Hadith scholar, Nusayba the warrior who defended the Prophet in battle, Al-Shifa the government official, Fatima al-Fihri the university founder, and many more. Within a single generation, the deeply ingrained practices of Jahiliyyah, the infanticide, the inheritance theft, the forced marriage, the denial of legal standing, were reversed. And yet today, you see Muslim-majority countries with some of the worst gender gaps on earth. You see girls denied education in the name of a faith whose prophet declared seeking knowledge an obligation on every Muslim. You see honor killings and forced marriage defended as Islamic by people who have never engaged seriously with the texts they invoke. How do you reconcile these two realities? You hold them together without flattening either. Because one is Islam, the other is what human beings, shaped by culture, driven by patriarchy, and motivated by the desire to maintain power, have done in Islam's name. The Quran is not responsible for what patriarchs did with its verses. The Prophet is not responsible for what cultures did with his legacy. And Muslim women around the world, from West Africa to Southeast Asia, from the Gulf to the West, are not passive victims waiting for outside liberation. They are scholars, advocates, jurists, and activists who are actively reclaiming their tradition, their texts, and the God-given rights that those texts have always contained. Again, the question is not, why does Islam oppress women? The honest question is, why have Muslim societies failed to live up to the standards their own revelation set for them? That is a question that Muslims must answer, for themselves and before their Lord. May Allah grant us the understanding to distinguish between His revelation and human distortion, and the courage to always stand with justice, even when it goes against our own traditions. Amin.